Hi folks, welcome to the Epochs of the Lotus Eaters, episode 85, The Battle of Kursk, or what is known otherwise as Operation Citadel. This is the opening of the Nazi invasion into the Soviet Union, is it not?
Not the opening, no.
Is it not?
No,
I'm no scholar on World War II.
Oh, okay. No, this is 1943. This is summer 43.
Right, okay. Good.
And so Operation Barbarossa, when they first went in, is 41.
Right, okay.
So this is after Stalingrad. But that's what I wanted to do, set up sort of the context for all of this.
Yeah. Because like I said, I personally, right, just to explain why I don't know very much about World War II, is because we had to do it repeatedly in school, over and over, and all it is trenches and dead people and black and white photos of sadness. And I was like, oh, this is really depressing. I get it. World War II is terrible. I get it. It's awful. And so I ended up doing geography rather than history in my GCSEs just because of that. Really? You know, yeah, I was just like, no, I'm not interested in learning about people dying in trenches anymore. You know, it totally put me off history. And it wasn't until I was in like my mid-20s that I discovered like ancient history and medieval history, which was actually interesting to me. And so I've got a really poor knowledge of World War II, to be honest.
I've always been fascinated by people dying in trenches. I'm not even joking. Just always since I was a kid.
Oh, look, another trench. Look at all those dead people.
Yeah.
It doesn't do it for me.
And even though it's World War II, there are still loads of trenches, particularly in the Kursk offensives. Yeah. There's loads of trenches. They built thousands of miles of trenches, the Russians did.
Yeah.
They said if it was in a straight line, it would have stretched from Moscow to Madrid.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, ridiculous. We'll get into the details of all that. Yeah. But no, if you're a history fan, history nerd, you've got to get involved in World War II. I was one of those kids where sort of out of time, where the generation older than me, you were raised really very much in the shadow of World War II, and you sort of almost couldn't avoid just taking it all on by osmosis even, whereas our generation not so much so, but I still just did, always fascinated by particular planes, particular tanks, bit of a tank buff.
But our boomer teachers were still like, you know, oh, World War II, and it was like the 80s and 90s. I'm like, this was more than half a century ago. You know, I mean, it's a big deal to you guys, but it's so far in the past from my perspective as a like 15-year-old that I was just like, okay, but this is just really sad. Yeah, okay, I'm glad we won, and I'm sad that everyone died. I don't like the Nazis. I don't really like the communists either, but it just didn't grip me.
I get though, for some people of our generation or younger, it's effectively as remote as the Napoleonic era or the ancient world or something. It's just a different world.
Yeah, it's totally out of time.
Right.
You know? They didn't have what we have now. They didn't think like we think now. It's just to me, it's just another historical period.
Right. You know? I do get that. But I loved World War II. Again, when I sort of made, because ancient history is my true forte, but I'm trying to be a bit of an all-rounder.
Yeah.
And so at different points in my life, I've been fascinated by World War II, different bits of World War II. For example, I am really interested in the life of Patton, George Patton, the American general. And we're not going to talk about him or anything like that in this one. But I think if you to come to terms with World War II, you have to grapple with the Eastern Front. So one of the first things I want to say is that Dan Carlin says in his great series, Ghosts of the Ostfront, the Eastern Front in World War II, on its own, it was the biggest war in history, just on its own.
And it's awful as well.
Yeah. Super, super brutal. Yeah. People doing really, really brutal things to each other. Did a mini-series with Josh about Operation Market Garden in Nazi-occupied Holland in 1944. Yeah. And there, the British, the Allies, and the Nazis were really quite gentlemanly to each other. Like after taking each other prisoner, giving each other cigarettes and congratulating each other on how well they'd fought and stuff like that. Don't really get hardly any of that on the Eastern Front. Well, they'll torture you and then they'll turn you into a road.
Germans fighting Russians, Nazis fighting communists. They don't respect each other. They don't like each other. They've got an ancient history of fighting each other and genociding each other.
One tiny example. One time, I think it was the Germans, but both sides did exactly the sort of thing. They overran an area, and there was a hospital there, and they just threw everyone out of the windows and hosed them down with water, and you're left there to freeze to death. Just an example. Yeah. Another example is the other side. The Russians captured a load of Germans. Again, just laid them in the mud, so it was really muddy. Hosed them down, they freeze to death, and then you've got a better road surface. Things like that. I mean, You get the idea.
Mongol-style barbarity.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's true ideological and even racial animus between them. Yeah. In fact, one of the things, very broadly speaking, is that historians, when you can look back on this sort of thing with perfect hindsight, said that the Germans could well have expected that a lot of the places they, in inverted commas, liberated in the East could well have been very friendly and fought on their side.
Ukraine.
Right. Places like modern Ukraine or Belarus or even parts of Russia, because where the Soviets or the Stalinist regime had been unbelievably brutal to them, the Germans could have, been true liberators, but they didn't. They saw them as sort of Slavic subhumans or something, and so treated them very brutally. So they sort of threw away a big opportunity there.
So what we're saying is that if the Nazis were a bit more liberal, they could have probably done a good job there. But
whereas they weren't, and they were into sort of collective punishment and things. Yeah. And so they suffered hugely from basically partisan actions behind their lines. Yeah. And in the Battle of Kursk, which is actually, it's not just one single action at all, but especially in the run-up to Kursk, there were lots and lots of so-called partisan actions behind that. When I say lots, I'm talking about they blew up 40 bridges. They blew up 300 odd trains. Huge things, really big, sort of almost game-changing stuff. Yeah. Just because the people behind the German lines were not going to have it, not going to lay down.
And the thing is as well, in modern warfare, infrastructure is everything. If you can't get materials to the front line, your men have no guns, no bullets. Yeah. No fuel. You can't move. The army goes nowhere. The tanks are just in the mud. And this happens a lot. Where they just abandon the tanks then. They're out of fuel. What are you going to do? You've got no ammo. What are you going to do? This giant war machine is totally worthless. It's not like in, Henry V or something, where he can march through France covered in mud, but he's still got his guys with their longbows and their swords. It's not the same.
Yeah, you're a fully self-contained unit.
Yeah.
For example, the army of Henry V in northern France in the early 15th century. Yeah. Whereas here, you have to always be thinking about your supply lines. Yeah. And if it looks like your supply line is going to get cut off, well, you're going to have to change all your plans and make a huge retreat or something. Because, without any oil and ammo. Yeah.
And not to mention the fact that, what have they got, 1 million men, 2 million men? Yeah. How do you feed that? Okay, Henry V's got 9,000 men. Great, we can forage off the land. We can find fruit in the forests. We can raid farmers' homesteads and stuff like this. But you've got 2 million guys. You can't do that. Yeah. You need to keep. If you want them to march anywhere, they've got to have a regular supply of decent food.
And lots of horses as well is another thing. Yeah. Most people say that, of course, we are in the mechanised age.
It's not that mechanised.
But, it's not entirely mechanised.
A lot of the guns are pulled by mules.
Right, yeah, lots of horses. So you need fodder for the horses and all sorts of things, yeah.
Yeah, it's starting to sound positively Napoleonic at this point, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, well, there's one thing to say also there, because, of course, Napoleon in 1812 invaded Russia, got all the way to Moscow, but ultimately failed and had to turn back. Now, the planners for Operation Barbarossa
were well aware of this.
They were absolutely well aware of it. Yeah. Von Clausewitz wrote about it. Yep. And they had copies, they would all read all the sorts of things. In fact, Dan Carlin, great line, he said, this isn't verbatim, but he basically said, the ghost of Napoleon hung over the German planners like a spectre.
Well, of course it does. Any invasion of Russia, you've got to look at Napoleon and be like, right, what did he do wrong? And the answer seems to be invading Russia, actually.
It's one of the classic blunders, along with, never go all in against the Sicilian, is don't try and invade, don't attempt a land invasion of Russia, because you can't win. Yeah. I mean, it's quite simple. You can invade France, all of France. Yeah. You just can't do that with Russia. It goes all the way to the Pacific.
And also, France's weather doesn't become like Russia's weather. Paris in the winter is not Moscow in the winter. And like you say, they can just keep retreating. You'll never catch them. They'll go on forever.
The Russians would sometimes call it General Russia, as in it's another
General
one of their
Winter.
General Winter. Sorry, what did I say? General Russia. Yeah. Sorry,
but
General Winter.
But that's what it is. That's a totally fair description of it.
Yeah.
You know? If it gets to November and you're still in Russia, you've done something wrong.
Yeah. Another thing to say about the Russian weather is that it's not that, the winter months are particularly terrible, but otherwise it's okay. No. On the, particularly in the sort of more southern theatre, in the summer, it's insanely hot. Well over 100 degrees. There were people from the Africa Corps that fought in Africa, and they said this is as hot or hotter than Africa.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
And then another thing, and this is very real, it sounds like it's a small detail, but it's really not, is that they would have, in the spring months, the ground would thaw out and become very, very, very muddy.
Yes.
A particular type of extremely sticky mud.
And if you've got 2 million people marching along this one path, that's just mud in and of itself.
And it will just swallow whole gun carriages or whole wagons, or even big tanks and things will get bogged down in it.
Yeah.
So, in fact, the Russian weather and conditions are nearly the whole time difficult one way or another.
Yeah.
It's not just the cold.
Yeah.
But Kursk happens in the summer. It's in sort of July and August. And the Russians sometimes said of the Germans that they were fighting the summer Germans, because the Germans kind of obviously just fought better in the summer. Can't really do that much in the winter.
Yeah.
And every summer, kind of, again, obviously, there would be a summer offensive. And the Russians are like, oh no, the summer Germans are coming, you know.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so a couple of things to sort of set this up. There's a very, very famous line. It's one of the greatest or most terrible pieces of hubris ever.
What, from Hitler?
From Hitler.
Yeah, I'm aware of this line.
Who said, about Russia, we just have to kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will come crashing down.
And honestly, I don't think it's totally unreasonable for him to have had that position either.
Right? No,
because
at that moment, because he said that before they invaded.
Yeah. That's why I thought this was framed the initial Russian invasion. Because I actually saw that quote in your notes, and I thought, right, okay, we're beginning at the beginning. I didn't realize we weren't. But it's not unreasonable because look at the Soviet Union. Look at what they've been doing. You know, for the last 25 years, it's been chaos in Russia. You know, right. How many millions of people fled the Soviet takeover of Russia? You know, how many stories must have filtered out of Russia? I mean, famines, you know, terrible oppression, churches burned, cathedrals burned, Christian genocides, all this sort of stuff. And so you can see as someone on the outside being like, wow, it's chaos in there. This is disgusting. We, you know, like he says, you know, just kick in the door and the whole thing's going to collapse. Not an unreasonable position, actually.
Right. One of the things that played into Hitler's thinking there is that the Russians had a war with Finland, the Winter War,
and they lost.
And they eventually won, but they got a bit humiliated in the attempt.
Okay,
and
Pyrrhic victory then.
Yeah, some sort of Pyrrhic victory there. Yeah. The Finns did very, very well for themselves. But
the Russians learned what it was like to invade Russia, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Because I remember reading about, what's that sniper who killed 500 guys or something?
Yeah, he's one of the great, most prolific snipers of all time. Yeah. I can't remember the guy. He eventually got shot in the face, didn't he? He got his own jaw blown off.
Yeah, something like that. But
I can't remember the guy's name.
So. I remember, I think in fact it was Dan Carlin again, where he was talking about how they were trying to build a road or something like that. And they were just sending guys out to get shot, but put down one bit of the railroad or something, and then another guy gets shot, and it's just like, God, you know, it's just going to show you what the Russians think of their own men, basically. You know, this is atrocious.
We have lots of examples of that.
Yeah.
In fact, the one story is where what happens is you don't disobey an order from above.
No,
because you and him will probably be shot.
Yeah.
So even if the order means that your entire battalion are going to get killed needlessly, you still do it.
So that you get shot.
Right. There's one story of, again, Dan Carlin tells it in Ghosts of the Ostfront, where some medium officer, all his men were from the Central Asian steppe and they couldn't swim. Most of them hadn't even seen a river before, right? And the order was to cross a river. And he said to his superior officer, he said, well, we haven't even got any boats or anything. And he said, I don't care. The order from above me is that you cross the river. And so they nearly all but 5 of them drowned.
It's just comical. It's so stupid.
And he goes back to his senior officer, that's like a captain talking to a colonel, saying, well, no, we didn't cross the river. They nearly all drowned. Yeah. And the colonel guy's like, well, at least we followed the order.
Oh, brilliant. Well, there we go.
Human wave attacks, they were still doing, the Russians were still doing in World War II, human wave attacks.
Oh, I'm sure that worked against German machine guns.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah. Human wave attacks, yes, but we do have essentially unlimited ammo and rapid fire.
Yeah. Yeah. Another few things that played into Hitler thinking that the whole edifice would come crashing down is that everyone knew that Stalin was, unless you're a party member, was feared and hated in Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, he'd killed something like 15 million of his own peasants, kulaks, for being middle class, for being bloodsuckers. Yeah.
Middle class.
For owning a horse or something.
They have a cow. Okay, look at the bourgeoisie over there. Okay, calm down.
Yeah.
You know, it's a we personally now wouldn't call the kulaks middle class.
Yeah.
Doing well for a Russian peasant.
Some modern leftists try and say that that's Western propaganda, but read Alexander Solzhenitsyn and it's just not.
Yeah.
It's not. In 1937, Stalin purged the officer corps of the Red Army.
That's right.
Sort of massively, insanely, sort of got rid of nearly all the good ones.
But we're doing human wave attacks. We don't need good officers.
Right, exactly, yeah. I don't want them thinking for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. What would be the point of a good officer? You know, he's just in the wave. Who cares?
Mm-hmm. And then there was even more on top of that. So in World War One, a lot of, Hitler himself was in World War One, so on the Western Front, but lots of these generals were on the Eastern Front. And they saw that they could win big battles in World War One on the Eastern Front with far fewer men because they were just well drilled and well trained and professionals, and the Russian armies weren't.
Yes, the Germans had the kind of Prussian idea towards war, whereas the Russians kind of had almost like the Napoleonic view towards war. Actually, I'll just spend lives.
Mm. Yeah, we can exchange time for space, or space for time rather.
Yeah.
We don't need to be a really, really efficient sort of modern combined arms force.
Yeah.
We don't have to do that.
And I remember seeing a thing that the Soviet Union had some like 400 to 500 million people in it, you know, at its peak. And so it's like, okay, you do have a massive pool of manpower. There's no denying it, you know. And so it's like, okay, well, you know, Germany's got what, 80 million at the time, 70 million, something like that. It's like, it's not an irrational calculation to say, well, we're just going to spend lives, you know, for every two of ours that die, and if they kill a German, that's a net gain for the Russians, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean but it's awful calculus, you know. But
the Politburo don't care.
No.
So there's a combination of the Winter War where the Russians look bad. They purged their own officer class.
I didn't actually realise they won the Winter War. I thought they lost that. But okay, fair enough. I was wrong.
Eventually, they took their sweet time about it, and it was very, very costly.
Yeah.
And then the lot of the German officers' experience on the Eastern Front in World War One. But then also, sort of on top of that, the Germans had done extremely well before 1941 in World War Two. They'd swept through some of the Scandinavian countries, Belgium, Holland, France. Places in the Mediterranean, Yugoslavia, places in the Balkans, each one taking a few weeks here or there. You know, France in, 2 or 3 weeks or something. They thought, with this Blitzkrieg thing, we've sort of kind of immediately mastered it. So not only are the Russians weak and easily knock overable, but we're also the best of the best.
Which is fair analysis, but also when you look at the raw land mass of the places you're talking about, well, okay, the places you've conquered so far are basically, about half of like the European side of Russia? Like Russia is just so phenomenally big.
Yeah.
You know, okay, you walk through France, great. You know, that's like that from there. And now you've got all the way over here to go. It's like, okay.
Yeah. The distance is...
You need some calipers on the map. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, the distance just from the German-Polish border to Volgograd or Stalingrad is gigantic.
Yeah.
It's absolutely gigantic, you know.
And it's mostly flat, isn't it?
Well, there's all that in that particular case. Well, it's the Eurasian steppe.
Yeah.
There's various mountain range. I mean, the Caucasus mountain range, but that's a bit more south. But
yeah, because I assume they went around that.
Sometimes, in fact, in the Kursk offensives, sometimes it is just completely open steppe, which is sort of perfect tank territory. And other times there will be forests and other not mountains, but it'll be hilly country. So it's not all perfectly flat, but yeah, quite a lot of the time it will just be open flat steppe.
But what I mean is, with open flat steppe, you don't get civilization, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're going like days between each city or town. You know, it's not like the French countryside,
right?
Where you go, an hour between villages or a couple of hours between cities. You know, you just like knock.
Yeah.
No. You can be going literally days before meeting another village. Encountering another village, and so it's just this vast sea of grass, or some forests and some hills, great, but it's nothing for such a long period of time.
Like a land ocean,
that
stretches to the horizon, in all directions,
with nothing in it, and and this is why you have the steppe peoples. What they have, just big mobile civilization of horses and herds that just constantly moved eating grass. So there's a reason that they adapted to that terrain in the way that they did. And like I lived in Germany and I haven't lived in France, but I've been through France plenty of times, and honestly, they're not terribly different to England in the way that they're laid out. It's lots of small villages all over the place, and then a couple of like large cities. But a lot of them aren't even large cities, not large, like you think an American city, and so it's just like, just land ocean compared to that. So the Germans just, they don't know what they're in for, I think, which is weird because they've invaded Russia before, haven't they? So they've fought with Russia before.
In World War One,
so you'd think they'd be like, I don't know.
And they had the accounts of 1812 as well. So they sort of knew, they're far from stupid. They knew the distances involved, absolutely knew the distances involved.
Yeah.
And they sort of, you can make an argument that they nearly did it as well. They got to Leningrad, modern day St. Petersburg, and besieged it. They got they got to Moscow. Mm-hmm. There's accounts of Army Group Centre seeing the spires of the Kremlin. They got to the outskirts of Moscow.
But the thing is, a lot of people got to Moscow and then died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they got to Stalingrad. They got to Volgograd, on the Volga. That's amazing, really.
Yeah.
That they got there.
As far as I'm aware, the only people who did anything by achieving Moscow, reaching Moscow, were the Mongols and the Poles. In the 18th century, there was a Polish sack of Moscow, which no one ever talks about, but it must be a really interesting story.
Yeah. And of course, the Mongols were coming from the other direction, coming from the east.
Yeah, exactly.
But they swept over and past it. Yeah.
But if you're coming from, Siberia, you're used to the terrible weather. You know what's going on.
I think in different centuries, it's just a different game, though, isn't it? So, for example, the Mongols, in the 13th century would it have been, early 14th century? They're really sort of the Grand Dukes of Muscovy. It's a bit different to sort of a Stalinist Soviet state.
Oh yeah, they didn't have the resources, obviously.
But so anyway, it's not a completely insane opinion for Hitler and his general staff to think if we just kick the door in, the whole thing will collapse. Although it is proven to be one of the most terrible pieces of miscalculation of all time. But
this it makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? So why was the average Russian fighting for the communist regime? Because, and like you say, it's not actually unreasonable for Hitler to think, right, this is an illegitimate government, right? It's a government by coup that has tyrannized and terrorized its own population. Don't get me wrong, he's a Nazi, so it's not like he's making a moral judgment. But it's as a rational calculation, you can see, but okay, well, how much are the Russians actually going to fight for this government? And so, it's really not unreasonable for Hitler to be like, look, if we go in there with, a significant punch, knock out a couple of armies, maybe they'll just capitulate because the government won't be able to conscript anyone or something like this.
Yeah, like the Bolshevik experiment is barely 25 years old.
Yeah.
Would it be? Yeah, right.
And probably hated.
Oh, yeah, by also,
by literally millions of Russians.
Yeah. And it's a good question. I think it's a combination of terror.
Yeah.
That is like not really a viable option to not fight when you're conscripted.
Because they'll probably kill your family.
Your whole family go to the Gulag or are just killed.
Yeah.
And also, apparently, Stalin and the Russian sort of propaganda machine were quite good, and they played on the idea of Mother Russia and that it's your patriotic duty And whereas the Bolsheviks and Stalin before Barbarossa didn't like to talk about Mother Russia exactly, and sort of the great history of Tsarism.
It's an anti-communist trope.
During World War II, he did start talking about that again, just to make people fight for Russia again. Well,
they weren't going to fight for communism, were they?
But it's a great question. For example, there's some very, very senior generals, like Rokossovsky was one of them. Next to Zhukov, is probably the most important Russian general in this story. He'd been in prison for years. I think they'd like disfigured him, smashed his teeth out and all sorts of stuff. And then they say, oh, actually, wait, we want you to fight again. He just did, loyally.
I just can't understand it.
It's difficult for you or I, free-born men, really, who value freedom and stuff, to get your mind around that.
Yeah, after smashing your face up, I'd like to fight for Russia again because the Germans are invading and actually we really need you. Oh, really? The Germans aren't actually going to disfigure me. You know, I bet if he'd defected to the Germans, they probably would have treated him at least half decently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just to finish up the point on the kicking the door in, on the whole rotten edifice, is that not only was it a miscalculation, but it's one of the most giant ones ever, because it ends up with the Red Army literally knocking on Hitler's bunker door.
Yeah.
Right? That's where it ends up.
Yeah.
It ends up with the Cold War. It ends up with Europe divided for 40 years or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So that was incorrect.
But honestly, though, would you have known prior to the attack? I don't think I could have said that, no, you're definitely wrong on this, Hitler. The Russians will definitely just throw millions of men into the meat grinder for communism. Yeah,
again, I did say it at the beginning, I need to stress it. You can only say that with hindsight. At the time, in 1940, when they're really thinking about pulling the trigger on Barbarossa, it's not a crazy calculation. No. It's not. And Hitler, his whole, one of the main tenets of his whole sort of worldview, ideology, was that we've got to destroy Bolshevism. Yeah. We've got to. That's sort of enemy number one. Yeah. Really. Yeah. Even more than the Jews or anything, it's Bolsheviks that need to be stamped into nothingness.
So I remember hearing stories of like a single German officer going into some Ukrainian village and coming back with a line of 50 prisoners of war, just walking behind them willingly because they hated the Bolsheviks. You know, it's like, okay, well, why not use this manpower? You know, oh yeah, but they're Slavic Untermensch and we have to treat them like scum. It's like, okay, but that's just you being Nazis. You know, that's not conducive to winning a war, you know, because a lot of these places wanted to flip. A lot of these places hated the Russians.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Give them a reason. No, we're going to persecute them as well. And not that I want the Germans to win or anything, but it's just, there's a part of me that's just like, you're just idiots. You know, like anyone who wasn't ideologically possessed would have had a much easier time of things, I think.
Yeah. I think maybe there's an element of Hitler convincing himself of it because he sort of, in a sense, politically had to attack Russia. Yeah. Because it was, again, sort of, that was the main thing he wanted to do. It was sort of the main thing he wanted to do because he blurred the line. Stalin wasn't Jewish, but there were a lot of senior Bolsheviks that were Jewish. And so the line between what a Bolshevik is and what a Jewish person is, it was almost one and the same in his mind.
Well, he viewed communism as a Jewish ideology.
Right, yeah. And particularly Bolshevism as well. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Because Lenin was Jewish.
And Trotsky and Kamenev and Zinoviev. A lot of them, I believe.
It was something like 80% Jewish, if I recall correctly.
Right. So it was sort of, if
you're a Nazi, you'll characterize that as a Jewish ideology.
Right, yeah. And so it was something that he sort of needed to do. There's a great story when the news came in 1941 that the Germans had invaded Russia. Churchill sent Anthony Eden a cigar saying, with compliments, and the Germans have invaded Russia. Right. Okay. So from our point, in other words, from our point of view, for us, it's amazing. It's so great.
But that's because they had a non-aggression pact, should we call it?
Yeah, the Soviet Nazi pact. Yeah.
Was it Molotov-Ribbentrop?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And so, like, and I recall, again, I recall having to learn about this, where didn't Stalin just go into a sort of catatonic state for a week?
Oh, yeah. It's a great story.
Yeah, and doesn't talk to anyone for a week. And everyone's like, what's going on? The Germans are, well, I mean, they're still like 1,000 miles away, but like, you know, they are coming. And Stalin doesn't have anything to say to anyone. And it's like, mate, of all the people on earth you can't believe have betrayed you, it's Adolf Hitler, is it?
Yeah.
But he was an honourable man. What are you talking about? Like,
He couldn't believe it when the first news came that the Germans had invaded their half of Poland.
Yeah.
Actually Barbarossa, when he started to invade Russia. The first people they arrested for lying.
Really?
They just didn't believe it. And then when it became clear that it was happening, Stalin had something like a mini breakdown.
Yeah.
He took himself off to his own personal dacha, his little house in the woods, and just wouldn't speak to anyone for ages, like a week or two.
Yeah, I'm sure it was at least a week.
A crazy long time. And then when eventually they sent a delegation of men out to his house, he assumed they'd come to shoot him.
Which would have been a good idea.
It would have been.
Yeah.
But when they said, Comrade Stalin, we need some sort of orders, what we can do, he was like, oh, okay, you're not here to just kill me. Okay. And he sort of gathered himself up again.
Which goes to show you how flimsy it is being part of a totalitarian regime, right?
Yeah.
Oh, God, there's a group of men coming. I think I'm about to die. Yeah. Oh, no, I'm in charge of everything. Right,
yeah,
okay. Right, okay. It was on a knife edge there. They were either going to kill me or give me complete command of the entire Soviet Union. Whew, that was close.
That is so telling, though, isn't it? What it must be like to be a tyrannical autocrat.
Yeah, it is.
It must. That's how you live, I imagine.
I can't even imagine it. It's ridiculous. Like I just think from the British perspective, where it's just like you never, like there's just never, like we've talked about this before, but all of the great, like, you know, heroes like Wellington and, you know, Churchill and, you know, John Marlborough and all this, there's never any even talk of them. Okay, they come back from the foreign war and the king's like, oh God, they might overthrow me. There's never any talk of them. No, it's completely inconceivable. You know, no one thinks about it. And so it's just so, like, such a different mentality. I just can't get over it.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.